Good afternoon. My name is Allison Kaplan. I'm Director of Education at the National First Ladies Library, located at the National First Ladies Historic Site here in Canton, Ohio. I want to thank you all for joining us today. As always, we encourage you to share where you're located in the chat. If you have any questions, if you have any technical issues, I'll be here typing away, sharing some links to pertinent information, upcoming programs, our speakers today's book. So we encourage you to use the chat and the Q&A function. If you have a question for today's speaker, please leave that question in the Q&A and we will get to it at the end today. If you are having an issue hearing me today or connecting, I do want to mention, or if you have to leave, we live stream on Facebook and we share out on YouTube the following day. If you connected with the program through Eventbrite, we recommend clicking out so it opens Zoom. It's just a much more seamless, easier way to watch the program and experience it. So those are my technical things. And again, happy to troubleshoot with you always. And we have some really tech-savvy visitors too, who are always happy to help me out. So those are my technical things for the day, but I do want to mention some upcoming programs. I know some of those are zooming by. I always put our Eventbrite link in the chat, so you'll be able to connect and find out about some of our upcoming programs. This is kind of our start and kickoff to the school year. Even if you're not in school, you're probably a student, and like us, you're a student of history and all things women history and first ladies. So we have some really exciting upcoming programs for the year. I want to share just a few of them with you before we get started. We have a regular film series and book series. We work with our local neighbors, the Stark Library, to connect you with a film, usually a documentary, that you can screen at home, themed around women's history. This month, we are watching Daring Doctors of the 19th Century. So you can register for that. If you're local or an Ohio person, you can click and get the Canopy link right away. If not, I will send one your way, a barcode that you can connect with the film. Meet us here next week and discuss the film. It should be really interesting. If you're here for our legacy lecture talk today, you're probably wondering what's coming up next month. Next month, October 5th, we are going to be hosting a friend of our organization, Annette Dunlap, who is going to be speaking about Lou Henry Hoover, another great first lady, and her White House years. She'll be discussing her new book, A Woman of Adventure. We're so excited to have Annette here to discuss the book. It's a really great book. October 14th, if you're local to us, two things, or if you're still traveling for the year, we have a great exhibition up here at the NPS First Ladies site, curated by the National First Ladies Library, honoring the centennial of Nancy Reagan. So Nancy Reagan, An American Story. It is a great exhibition, delves deep into her life, her partnership with the president, her career, and her many issues, social issues that she helped to represent. So we're excited about it. We will have work up from the Reagan Library through October, as well as the Reagan Ranch. So get in to see some of that glitzy dynasty 1980s fashion goodness that you love. And then we have some Halloween activities coming up. Our children's program, Fun with Flotus, Slightly Spooky Stories. Our Curator talk is looking at Victorian death scenes. October 24th, we're going to be hosting Cooking with the First Ladies. We're going to be looking at Abigail Adams. And I forgot to mention, we have a great program, a music program happening in person in Canton, October 14th, called East Wing Songs. We have performances of amazing new compositions inspired by the First Ladies. and a really cool upcoming school program for teachers and kids, featuring Marilyn Singer and Nancy Carpenter, who wrote a book of children's inspired poems related to the First Lady. So have you heard about Lady Bird? So we're super excited about all those programs. Hopefully you can join us for one of them. I think it's going to be a great year for the National First Ladies Library, connecting you with all of the amazing stories of the First Ladies, and for us to connect with you too through some of our great audience discussion programs, which we love so much. So without further ado, I want to introduce today's speaker. Elaine Rice Bachmann is the State Archivist of Maryland and the former Director and Curator of Artistic Property at the Maryland State Archives. She received her master's degree in early American culture from the Winterthur Program at the University of Delaware after studying art history at Indiana University. She has written and lectured extensively on Maryland's state-owned art collection, as well as the history of Maryland's State House and Government House. She is the co-author of Designing Camelot, the Kennedy White House Restoration and Its Legacy, which I have here. I'm very excited about it. Based on her master's thesis at the Winterthur, initially published in 1997 and in a new edition by the White House Historical Association in 2021. She's the guest curator of the exhibition, Jacqueline Kennedy and H.F. Dupont, From Winterthur to the White House, which is now on view at the Winterthur Museum through January 2023. So we want to welcome you, Elaine, and I'm going to turn off my camera and I will be moderating the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison. What an honor to be here. I'm so delighted to be invited to present to you and on behalf of the National First Ladies Library, the work of the library I greatly admire. And what an auspicious day as well, because Allison and I were chatting before the program began. The portraits of President Obama and Mrs. Obama will be unveiled at the White House this afternoon, which is very exciting. And that is also thanks to the White House Historical Association, which sponsors those portraits and which sponsored the new edition of the book that James Archer Abbott and I wrote together. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share with you the exhibition that is at Winterthur. So I'm going to share my screen now as I get started and bring up what I hope you can all see now, the title of the exhibition, Jacqueline Kennedy and H.F. Dupont, From Winterthur to the White House. So the exhibition really came together as a result of the new edition of Designing Camelot being published in 2021, which itself was in homage to Mrs. Kennedy, because the White House Historical Association wanted to honor Mrs. Kennedy and the founding of the White House Historical Association, the 60th anniversary of that, which occurred in 2021. So in doing so, they looked back to the work that James and I did in publishing the first edition of Designing Camelot, which came out in 1997. And my part in that was due to my own graduate thesis while I was at the Winterthur Museum program as a graduate student in the early 90s. So despite my gray hair, I was born after the Kennedy administration, but I was always aware of the role that Mrs. Kennedy played in restoring the White House. And I think that's because my mother was so impacted by it. I grew up in Southern Indiana. My mother at that time in the 1960s was raising 5 children then and was just enamored of what Mrs. Kennedy was doing in the White House and always talked about that television tour that happened in 1962. So I sort of grew up with this awareness of Mrs. Kennedy having done something really special in the White House. But it wasn't until I went to graduate school at the museum founded by Henry Francis Dupont, the Winterthur Museum, which was his collection of American decorative arts, thousands and thousands of objects that he collected over his lifetime that he put into period rooms in his house. In fact, he added a wing onto the Winterthur Museum of hundreds more rooms to fit in all of the objects he had collected. And then he turned it into a museum of American decorative arts. So it was this sort of pairing of Mrs. Kennedy and Mr. Dupont, when I realized that connection of the place I was going to school and this project I had always admired, that I realized it could be potentially a graduate thesis. And so that was what inspired me to go into the archives and look at all of the things that related to this period of history. And here you see one of the headlines of the time: the White House redecoration is in Winterthur's image. And so when Mrs. Kennedy launched her project in 1961, such a savvy woman on so many levels, she knew she needed to not just be a first lady who was redecorating the White House. She needed to ally herself with the prestigious museum curators and directors of the time. So this would be seen not as just a redecoration, but a restoration, as she famously told Life magazine. So Henry Dupont was really the obvious person for her to connect with. And it's sort of unknown who was the first person to introduce them, but certainly her own friendship with Jane Reitzman, who was very well acquainted with Mr. Dupont, she was certainly suggesting Mr. Dupont. Mrs. Kennedy's own uncle was involved with the Winterthur board, Lefty Lewis. There's some suggestion that Mrs. Kennedy's first idea was to borrow things from the White House, from the Winterthur collection for the White House. Well, that was a non-starter, but having Mr. Dupont chair a committee that would sort of bring a scholarly background, a gravitas to what she was doing, was thought to be a very smart path forward. And so what you see on the left here is one of the only photographs really of committee members in the White House. And this is the special committee for paintings actually gathered in the green room with Mrs. Kennedy in December of 1961. And she is sitting on the settee there with James Fosberg, who was the chair of the special committee for paintings. But she's turned around and is speaking to Henry Francis Dupont. So some of the other members of the committee are all gathered there. There were really very few formal committees, as we'll get into later on in talking about the project. But just to get back to sort of the root of the exhibition, it is the Winterthur Archives. And this is a cart presented to me as I was beginning to go through again all of the correspondence between Mr. Dupont and Mrs. Kennedy, all of the records of the commission, all of the paint swatches and samples and things that had been lovingly cared for by Winterthur's curators and archivists over the years when I first came upon them in 1991. I was really astonished that I was one of the first people to look at these sort of as a whole to tell the story of the restoration. And it was quite exciting to do that and to then be given permission to write a graduate thesis on that topic. And this really represents only a portion of the archival material at Winterthur that represents the documentation of this period of time and Mr. Dupont's role. But in them are hundreds and hundreds of letters between Mr. Dupont and Mrs. Kennedy, between Mr. Dupont and the curators at the White House, the various museum directors and curators who were involved, and collectors. And together, it really tells that whole story of how the project was started, how it was organized or not organized, as it were, how decisions came to be made, and the thought processes of those people who were involved. And it was really, only 60 years later, our methods of communication are so vastly different now than they were then. So even to put this exhibition together, it was really so much of a sort of a feast for the eyes in terms of letterhead, handwriting, type font, telegrams, such a different way of organizing a project than we would today, rifling off our texts and our emails. So it was an interesting reminder that only 60 years ago, communication was so different. And this is just a smattering of images from those archives. Mrs. Kennedy's very distinct handwriting. Anyone who's ever studied Mrs. Kennedy's handwriting can immediately recognize it. The letterhead for the Fine Arts Committee down below, and some of the more formal correspondence between Mrs. Kennedy and Mr. Dupont. And of course, both of them were constantly traveling all over the world. And so many of their letters are by airmail. Many of them are delivered as telegrams and to various addresses throughout the world. So it's quite exciting to read. So getting back to Mr. Dupont and why he was chosen, as I said, he had turned his home, which he had been collecting Americana from the 1920s onward. By 1952, he really styled himself as an academic collector. He was beginning to pay attention not to just the aesthetics of how a room came together, but also sort of the social history behind objects. And very quickly, what he was doing was putting together period rooms. So if he had collected New England furniture from Salem, Massachusetts, of a period made between 1790 and 1810, he was putting it in a room whose architecture literally might have been taken from a house in Salem, Massachusetts at that same time and reconstructed in his home, and then became the backdrop for decorative arts of that same period. He would then create textiles believed to represent curtain styles of that time, or upholstery of that time, very much though from a decorator's perspective early on. But by 1950, the 1950s, in fact, 1952 and 51, when he was creating a public museum out of his home and inviting to the public in, it was the first museum of its kind in America, the first museum of American decorative arts. And he really, again, as I was saying, was styling himself as more of an academic and allying himself with scholars of the period. And in fact, created the first graduate program. And you see some of the students here on the right, a graduate program for studying American decorative arts, which was sort of a training ground for museum curators. So he had founded the museum and the program in the early 1950s. So by 1961, when Mrs. Kennedy is looking to bring an academic, a scholarly approach, a seriousness to what she was doing in the White House, Mr. Dupont was the perfect ally. Their families had been in the same social circles, but she had not personally met Mr. Dupont before that time. And why was she so interested in what she was in terms of transforming the White House? This gives you an idea of the rooms as they looked when Mrs. Kennedy moved into the White House in 1961. Perfectly fine rooms, but not something that she thought reflected the history, the importance of the presidency, the importance of American history. And she very famously said that she had a disappointing visit when she was 11 years old as a tourist in the White House with her sister and her mother. She felt there was nothing of historical importance to really grab the visitor. Nothing was explained to her. There were no objects to look at that felt like they had a connection to American history. She said that the National Gallery of Art and Mount Vernon had made a far greater impression on her. And her opinion was really unchanged then when she saw the rooms again as the guest of Mrs. Eisenhower before she moved into the house. So when she knew her husband was going to be president, she knew that the White House interiors were going to be something that she focused on. And she did it like all things from a student's approach. She was very well-educated, very well-read, very concerned with American history, as was President Kennedy. And before she went down to Palm Beach for the period after the election and before the inauguration, she had checked out to her from the Library of Congress all of the books that she could about the history of the White House and its interiors, and she studied those. So she really came to this project knowing what prior first ladies had tried, knowing the efforts to bring in the antiques into the house, reading about the furnishing campaigns of the early presidents, so that she really had an eye to what might be out there, either in the marketplace or in storage rooms, or what would be the periods that would be appropriate in interpreting the White House. And what you see here is the entrance to the exhibition, where we begin to sort of tell that story and bring into these spaces some of those archival objects, some of the archival papers, and then objects that you'll see later on. So they were quite an odd couple, really. I mean, she was 31, as we know, one of the youngest first ladies in American history. He was 80, so 5 decades separate them, and I really call them an odd couple, but a couple that together really brought their talents and interests to bear and collaborated and brought an American history lesson to the American public. And you'll see as you walk into the exhibition, which I should say is at the Winterthur Museum. The Winterthur Museum now has a large gallery space in addition to being able to tour Mr. Dupont's home and the period rooms. And it's here in the gallery space that the exhibition is. And I knew, and you can see as you look through the doorway, I knew that the primary sort of the centering story of this whole exhibition would be that television tour of 1962, because I think that's the moment that Mrs. Kennedy's project really just exploded onto the national scene. A television program watched by more than any other program at that time, 80 million viewers, shown on all 3 networks. It's really something that brought her project into America's living rooms. And as I say, it really was a history lesson for the country. We tell about that tour through the display of period television cameras on loan from the Museum of Broadcast Technology in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, and the suit owned by the John F. Kennedy Library. It is a reproduction of the actual suit that Mrs. Kennedy wore during that television tour, but it is the one that is normally on display at the John F. Kennedy Library. So we were very grateful for that loan. But just quickly in thinking about that tour, it was such an unusual program because it was very intimate in the way that the cameras were concealed, the microphones were sort of concealed. She had a body mic on, and it just seemed like a very casual, intimate tour of the First Lady leading Charles Collingwood through the rooms. And I think what people were really struck by, in addition to her soft voice, was her knowledge. And what they didn't know was that she really had planned the whole tour route herself. She wrote her own narration. She decided what objects would be focused on. She was not always one who wanted to get in front of the cameras. She was sort of famously reluctant to ever give any interviews, of course, but when she was asked to do this as a result of some of the publicity that was getting out about the program, she was convinced to do so, and she really made it her own. And I would say that this event, this television event, for anyone who was skeptical about this sort of high society prep school, New England prep school woman who had moved into the White House, only 31 years old, I think it really sealed her in the American imagination as a woman who was bringing this history and beauty to the White House, and very knowledgeable on her own. So that's the center of the exhibition, which focuses on the tour. As you go around the first space, we have some real treasures from the archives, this being the guest book that Mrs. Kennedy signed on her one and only visit to the Winterthur Museum, which occurred on May 8th of 1961. As I said, she had not met Mr. Dupont before engaging with him and asking him to be the chairman of her Fine Arts Committee, and he had really hit the ground running, forming the advisory committee, naming the members, starting to send out letters to dealers and museums and looking for loans, etc. And he invited Mrs. Kennedy to come see for herself what he had done at Winterthur. So she came to Wilmington on May 8th, 1961. She brought with her, they flew the Caroline, the president's private plane. She brought Jane Reitzman, as also Mary Lasker and Florence Mahoney, who were members of the Fine Arts Committee with her. She was the only one who signed the guest book, as was tradition at that time in the Port Royal Entrance Hall when you came into Winterthur. And these are some photos of her visit from that day, which I very happily sort of rediscovered. They hadn't been published since the original visit in 1961. So it was so exciting to see her standing on the Montmorency Stair Hall, which is a very famous, iconic 4-story staircase in the Winterthur Museum. I hadn't even seen these when I was a student. They must have been really tucked away. So it was very exciting to recover these. There she is on the Montmorency Stair Hall, and here she is inside the Dupont dining room, admiring the silver tankards made by Paul Revere and the Chinese export porcelain. And I think what Mr. Dupont, what he said he was trying to do was show her that you could have a really swell house with American things, because he knew of her interest in French decorative arts. He knew of her preference for French decorative arts. She had studied at the Sorbonne. She had a French heritage herself, as did Mr. Dupont. And she was aware that the early presidents had selected French things for the White House. So he also wanted her to see that you could have a really swell house, as he said, with American decorative arts. And she wrote him the most wonderful thank you note, which we have in the exhibition, and here you see reproduced here. She was really a master of the thank you note, having been brought up in a time of great civility, one that we sort of look at longingly today. But she was very good at ingratiating, making her host feel very special. And she wrote to Mr. Dupont and was really gushing about that she she had an ambition for her old age. She said our old age, referring to her and the president, that they could become gatekeepers at Winterthur, which is very poignant. And she also closes it by saying that it's marvelous that this country can produce someone like the astronaut, but I think it is much more awesome to have someone like you, which is just a reminder of, living in the space age. She had come up to Winterthur on the same day that they had hosted a reception for Alan Shepard in the White House that morning. He had just been on his mission. And then in the exhibition, as we move sort of beyond telling the background of the Fine Arts Committee, talking about the first curator who had come from Winterthur, Lorraine Waxman Pierce, and talking about sort of how she was setting up plans for the White House and how Mr. Dupont had made an early trip to the White House and sort of sketched out what kind of objects he thought were needed. We take you through 3 vignettes of the iconic parlors of the White House: the green room, the red room, and the blue room. And in doing so, we continue to bring some of the archival information about how each of these rooms were designed and the objects that were brought into them, but also put objects from either on loan or from the Winterthur collection into the spaces. No one should be surprised to know that the White House does not loan from its decorative arts collection. Not that I didn't ask, but in sort of bringing together vignettes of what these rooms looked like and how Mrs. Kennedy and Mr. Dupont and her advisors were putting them together, we could draw on collections directly from the Winterthur Museum as sort of stand-ins for, in this case, the federal furniture of the green room. But above the small desk, you see a mirror that is actually on loan from Mount Vernon. That is the looking glass that was in President Washington's home in Philadelphia. Of course, he didn't live in the White House. His home was in Philadelphia. And it is one of the a looking glass that was loaned to Mrs. Kennedy as well. Because as I mentioned early on, as the curator got on board, as they began to acquire things through donors and from different dealers, they didn't have a lot of furnishings to work with. They were just starting to uncover what was in storage and to get it restored. So Mrs. Kennedy asked museums if they would loan anything that had a presidential association. And she was very happy that the Mount Vernon Ladies Association allowed her to borrow this looking glass, and they've loaned it to our exhibition as well. The museum also, the exhibition includes a significant amount of loans from the Salamandre Archives, because Salamandre, as the premier American textile manufacturer, worked closely with the White House to provide as much of the fabrics for upholstery and curtains that they could, that were within sort of the direction of the advisory committee to use period documents. What they could not weave was woven overseas somewhat surreptitiously, which we'll talk about when we get to the blue room. But in amongst the archival things and the objects are wonderful loans from Salamandre. And here, that looking glass from the collection of Mount Vernon, which we're so happy to have on loan. The red room, an iconic room, so associated with the Kennedys and that restoration. She took what was a red room and gave it this youthful new color of this cerise, this pinky red. And there's a wonderful letter that she writes early on to Mr. Dupont about these 3 rooms, where she says she always thought that their colors were just too hard, too harsh, this harsh green, hard red, hard blue. And she wanted to really keep these traditional colors because she knew that was important, but bring them a new vibrancy, something more rooted in historical colors. And of course, the distinct cerise of the red room will always be associated with the Kennedys, as well as the brilliant fabric that was made by Salamandre with the gold medallion over the red silk. The quote in this is an interesting play in the correspondence, because, not everyone always got along on a committee, as you can imagine, and there were different ideas. And sometimes Mrs. Kennedy had to sort of gently tell Mr. Dupont that she disagreed with him. And he was very opposed to a French mirror that was going to go in the red room, thinking that it had, it was too French for this American room. And she wrote, as long as there's an eagle, it doesn't matter if it's French. So that gives you an idea of her sort of brilliant diplomatic skills that she brought to the project. And here are our vignette of the red room. And I should say that the curtains that you see are wonderful sort of reproductions based on the period curtains that were placed in these rooms, made by Natalie Larson, who is such a wonderful textile historian and seamstress from Colonial Williamsburg. The table, the pier table that you see in this view is also on loan from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, as it was loaned to Mrs. Kennedy and placed in the Cross Hall. It was from the collection of Jerome Bonaparte, who had it in his home in New Jersey. And just going back into the archival side of things, as I mentioned, you know, in addition to bringing Mr. Dupont on board, having a fine arts committee, Mrs. Kennedy really understood that for her project to have longevity, to last beyond her administration and to be something meaningful, it needed to be rooted in really a new paradigm for how the White House was managed. And the reason there were not important decorative arts related to the earlier presidents is because there had never been any sort of inventory control up until 1961. There was no permanent collection. There was no law to protect furnishings in the White House to keep them from being sold at auction, you know, carried off when they were in disrepair, picked up by souvenir hunters, taken home by earlier presidents. So there just was no permanent collection that ensured that what was inside the White House would remain for future generations. So she worked with her husband's administration to create a legislation in 1961 that designated the interiors of the White House, not just the exterior, but the interior, to be protected by the National Park Service, and the collection to be a permanent collection that if it were not used by a sitting president and first lady, she understood there would be choices made, but it would not be alienated from the house. It would be stored by the Smithsonian and kept in perpetuity. So creating that permanent collection under the care of a curator, the first curator for the White House, Elaine Waxman Pierce, who was a graduate of the Winterthur Program, she established what is now a full-blown curatorial program of multiple curators with many important curators over time who've assisted first ladies, and in building a collection that is now a world-class decorative arts collection, all protected and all remaining as a part of the White House collection. Another part of Mrs. Kennedy's initiative, and again, looking back to that visit as a child where she said there wasn't even a guidebook you could buy, she was very dedicated to the idea that there needed to be something that a visitor could take away from a visit to the White House that helped explain their visit. And she was really dissuaded from this by her husband's advisors. Many people felt that it was going to be tacky to have a guidebook that was sold at the White House, that was somehow commercializing this very important national treasure. And she stuck to it. She knew that it was important. She knew that it would also be an important way to fund her program, because I should say, you know, this was an unfunded project. Within a couple of weeks of moving into the White House, she had spent the entire $50,000 appropriation in the redecoration of the private rooms with Sister Parish, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So there wasn't funding for this. She was relying on donations. She was relying on loans. And she knew that if there was a way to sell a guidebook, it could help fund her efforts. And so the first guidebook was published in 1962. She had the curator, Elaine Waxman Pierce, principally wrote the text along with Mrs. Kennedy herself, and also support from the National Geographic Association. She was very adamant that it be done quickly and that it would be out and ready for visitors as soon as possible. So in 1962, it was launched. The first 600,000 copies that were sold at $1 a piece sold out very quickly, and it is now in something like its 25th edition. So she was right. You know, this was a way to fund her project. This was also the beginning of the White House Historical Association, which was the nonprofit foundation that was created in order to publish the guidebook. And she sent Mr. Dupont the third, number 3 of the first edition, a special hardbound volume that he kept in his library for the rest of his life, and which is now a part of our archives. And you can see her personal note to him there. In addition to talking about the restoration of the rooms and the transformation taking place. The exhibition also talks about, the overall transformation of the presidency during the Kennedy years. Of course, they revolutionized what it meant to be entertained at the White House. They set up a portable stage in the East Room. They went out of their way to invite singers such as Grace Bumbry, who was a native of St. Louis, Missouri, but because she was Black, had no way to perform in the United States. She had a significant career in Europe, but didn't make her debut in America until the Kennedys invited her to perform in the White House in 1962. On the left, visitors from Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast in Africa. Down below, a photograph of the Kennedys' first state dinner, which was so unusual because it was held at Mount Vernon. That had never been done before, on the lawn of Mount Vernon. And so the Duponts were invited to nearly every state event that the Kennedys held while he was involved in her fine arts program. And she always sat him at her table. So the photograph below, where Mrs. Kennedy is seated directly across from Henry Dupont, and she's speaking to the president of Pakistan, who was the guest of honor that evening. So we have the ephemera from those events. And also a wonderful loan from the Kennedy, President John F. Kennedy Library and Museum of the original fabric storyboards for the private rooms that Sister Parrish put together. Mrs. Henry Parrish II, very important decorator of the time and a friend of the Kennedys. She had decorated their Georgetown townhouse. Mrs. Kennedy brought her in right away to create the spaces for the family, which again, these were the first young children to live in the White House since Teddy Roosevelt's era. So there were a lot of upgrades and changes that needed to be made. And we have the wonderful fabric samples of the nursery, Caroline's room, and Mrs. Kennedy's bedroom. And we tell that in the context of sort of the other changes taking place at the White House. Their attention to the exterior of the White House, Bunny Mellon's design of the Rose Garden, and the use of the exterior spaces as an extension of the image of the presidency. For the first time, inviting heads of state to be greeted at the White House rather than at the airport or Union Station, and creating a great display of America's military dress parades on the South Lawn. So really just so much about what happened during the Kennedy administration was new and precedent setting, and to think of how much that was accomplished in the short period of time that they were there is really, really astounding. And the final portion of the exhibition really is about the abrupt end. Obviously, the assassination of President Kennedy brought an end to the Mrs. Kennedy's program, but every decision that had been put in place by Mrs. Kennedy, and by that time, many of the rooms were nearing completion, was seen through by Lady Bird Johnson. And Mr. Dupont stayed on and assisted the Fine Arts Committee. By that time, it became the Committee for the Preservation of the White House, established by Lyndon B. Johnson. And Mr. Dupont, for as long as he lived, until 1969, was a part of that committee. And really, Mrs. Johnson did everything she could to honor the wishes of her predecessor in completing the rooms. And some of the ephemera in this section from the archives is from the funeral itself, which Mr. and Mrs. Dupont were invited to. So we have some of the ephemera from that. And then we really close the exhibition in talking about the legacy of the entire project and what they left behind with these two portraits. The one on the right, both of these portraits by Aaron Schickler. The one on the left there of Mr. Dupont, painted in 1968, just a year before he died. And the painting on the right, one of the studies that Aaron Schickler did for Mrs. Kennedy's official White House portrait. And of course, this audience knows this is not the official White House portrait. She shows a different study where she's wearing a long gown. This is a painting that's in a private collection, but from that same series that he painted in her New York townhouse, her New York apartment. So that's a romp through the exhibition. I'd really like to hear from all of you and answer questions. I hope you'll have a chance to visit. It's on display through January 8th. So those of you who are still traveling this summer and might find yourself on the East Coast, it's at the Winterthur Museum in Wilmington, Delaware. And with that, I'll stop sharing so Allison can send me your questions.
Hey, Elaine, that was amazing. It was so cool to see so much of the exhibition, and looking at the walls and thinking about the White House and the color and the way the exhibition looks almost like an interior design sketchbook or study. I'm wondering
That was very conscious, I should just say, and give
yeah.
credit to Charles Mack and Sally Warren Compert, who are the designers. They were really taken by the, first of all, those aesthetics of all the printed material, the typography of the 1960s, but also the idea that what Mrs. Kennedy was doing is what many of us do, maybe on a much less grand scale, but taking on a decorating project and being presented with choices. And so that is very consciously how it's presented.
Well, it's really lovely. I'm wondering, as you approach this project in book form, early on in your career and you're returning to it now, was there anything new that you discovered that surprised you?
Well, I think I was just reminded, and again, when I did this initially 30 years ago, and when Jim and I wrote the first edition of the book, you're 30 years younger. I think now what surprises me, and I guess because of the political climate we live in today, is how much collaboration there was, and how, of course, she was conscious that Mr. Dupont was a Republican and she was a Democrat. So she wasn't completely, devoid of the idea of partisanship, but there was so much collaboration and so much of a sense that they were all working towards something that was for the American people, that was going to go beyond their administration, beyond their lifetimes, and be contributing something to the history of this very important place in the history of the presidency. So I think even I'm just was reminded as an older person of how extraordinary it was and how young she was to be negotiating so many people. And I didn't even mention Stéphane Boudin, the French decorator who was principally responsible for the Blue Room and so many choices in the White House, and was somewhat unknown because, of course, to put forth that a French decorator had so much influence in the White House, she knew she couldn't do that, but he was very involved, and Mr. Dupont knew that as well. And so she was really negotiating so many different opinions and different pieces, and to have gotten so much done in such a short time, it's just, I just have so much admiration for her.
Can you speak a little more about this tension between the French, the Boudin, and the American, the Dupont viewpoint for the White House, and how that played out?
Of course, of course. So Mr. Dupont, he had styled himself really, he early in his collecting career, when he began collecting antiques in the 1920s, decided that he was going to focus on American handmade antiques of the period of colonial period up until the 1820s, 1840s, when machine technology began to get involved. And he really styled himself an Americanist, and he focused on American architecture, American furnishing. So, in going to the White House, he wanted to present this as an American house. But of course, the White House, given the time when it was built, the early presidents who were living in it, particularly after the burning of during the War of 1812, they were of a time when continental furnishings were being purchased and put in American houses. So there was very much a French influence in the White House that was very appropriate to be interpreted. And Mrs. Kennedy knew that. And the very famous suite of Belanger furniture that President Monroe had ordered from France for the Blue Room, and then was sort of being rediscovered piece by piece in storage, and through reproductions, and through restoration of the older pieces. It was very much a French aesthetic. And so in that Blue Room, which was funded by Jane Reitzman, it was Stéphane Boudin who was designing that entire space very, very appropriately in a French manner. And Mr. Dupont, understood this. He knew it was Mrs. Kennedy's house for her to make her choices, but that didn't stop him from sort of often criticizing and saying it was just too French. But I think, ultimately at Winterthur, he could make any decision he wanted, but he knew that this was her house. So there's definitely a push and pull that you see in the letters about choices being made for particular fabrics or particular colors, and ultimately it's always Mrs. Kennedy's decision, and most of the time she was siding with the French decorator.
You've talked a little bit about the connection to museum collections and tracking down, both for the White House and this exhibition, objects that would have been on view in the White House on loan. And I wondered if what the relationship was with former families in the White House related to this exhibition, as well as Mrs. Kennedy tracking down furniture and objects from the past.
Sure. Well, I mean, that was really what the excitement of being the first curator in the White House. Lorraine Waxman Pierce, who was aided by the registrar Bill Elder, William Voss Elder III, who became the second curator of the White House. You know, they really were going into storage and looking for things and finding wonderful things. I mean, the wonderful story of the pier table that was being used as a sawhorse in the carpentry shop. I mean, it's true. It might have been somewhat embellished, you know, Mrs. Kennedy throwing herself against the table to save it. But the truth of it was that some of these things had just wandered into storage. And so those things were sort of rediscovered and studied, and Lorraine Waxman Pierce wrote several academic articles for Antiques magazine about the history of these pieces. So again, sort of creating that scholarly approach to what was happening in the White House. The things that had been alienated, you know, many of them, you know, they weren't necessarily with any former families. They were auctioned away and in private collections. So some rare things would pop up through auction houses or through dealers, and things still find their way to the White House now. But following curators really made an effort to collect of the right period, to seek out those things with presidential association and provenance and bring them. And of course, the television tour is what made this so well known across the world, really. So it brought a great heightened awareness to potentially objects that found their way to the White House as well.
Thank you for that. A question from the chat. From the photographs of the 1950s of the beginning of the Winterthur graduate program, it appears that only men were admitted. When did Dupont admit women? Obviously, woman was the first White House curator. So
that's right. That
that
first photograph I showed, I think it happens to be just men. That's John Sweeney, who was leading a group of gentlemen speaking about pattern books, and Charlie Hummel, who became a curator at Winterthur as well as one of the students then. Women were admitted very early on. There was never an exclusion of women. And so some of the first classes had women as well. I only happened to show that one photo. But it is interesting. I mean, as a field, there were a great deal of men interested, and that sort of flip-flopped over time. When I was in the Winterthur program, we had very few men, but I think it's all balancing out again, hopefully.
There was another question in the chat too about Mr. Dupont's background. What inspired his interest in American decorative arts and collecting and preserving?
Mr. Dupont is one of the Duponts from Delaware. So the Dupont family writ large was very well off, having founded gunpowder mills during the Revolutionary War and ultimately what became the DuPont Chemical Company. He was from a branch of the family. He himself never was affiliated with the company. His grandfather and father were. He had the privilege of being extremely wealthy and getting to study whatever he wanted. So he went to Yale and studied horticulture, and remained very interested in horticulture throughout his life, because in fact, Winterthur was a farm, a working farm, a dairy farm. He specialized in a particular breed of cow and the milk that it produced, and had a very successful dairy. So Winterthur was a farm, and he also developed all of the grounds at Winterthur. Winterthur is as famous for its gardens as it is for its decorative arts, and he cultivated all of that. So he was deeply interested in horticulture, deeply interested in farming. It was a visit to his friend Electra Havemeyer Webb in Vermont in the 1920s, and seeing her collection of transfer print ceramics displayed in a very simple pine cupboard that just piqued his interest in Americana. I mean, it's really true. And from that point on, he began collecting American decorative arts, building a collection at that time, taking architecture out of old houses that were going to be demolished, and preserving them, if you will, by removing them from those houses and rebuilding them in Winterthur as his period rooms. Something today, we would consider that, not not the right way to preserve a building. But in his case, when things were being destroyed, he was picking these up, bringing them to Winterthur, and sort of then putting his collection, which because of his massive amount of wealth, he was able to fund, his every desire and have everything he ever wanted. So this collection grew to, 75,000 objects. So his background was truly an educated person, and then a collector who educated himself and began to surround himself with people who knew decorative arts, and associating himself with museums, collectors, and curators.
Thank you for answering that question. I have two more. So Jackie Kennedy, it's my understanding, only returned to the White House one time after the assassination, for the unveiling of her portrait. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about how this experience of preserving objects and turning the White House into this amazing museum space impacted the rest of her life.
Well, it's right. It's true. She only returned once. She was often invited and always said, of course, it would just be too painful to go back to that place. And so she had a private visit arranged by President and Mrs. Nixon in 1971 so that she and her children could come back and see the portraits of herself and President Kennedy. And she was very grateful for that private experience, but always refused any other invitations. But she remained, obviously, I think, very interested and proud of what she had done. It is a fact that when she died, and in her library in New York, she had every edition of the White House Guidebook. So I think the fact that she had been responsible for the founding of that, she must have been proud. Of course, she never spoke publicly, but she must have been proud of that association and the role that she played. And of course, her interest in preservation followed her all her life. And it's because of her interest in advocacy that Grand Central Station was saved in New York, that she really advocated for that design of McKim, Mead, and White, which of course she had been familiar with the McKim, Mead, and White architecture inside the White House. So she was a student all her life, and certainly the advocacy and the support and attention that she could bring to projects had a lot to do with historic preservation efforts in the 1970s, as well as historic preservation in Washington before she even left the White House, the saving of Lafayette Square, the preservation of the block of townhomes that includes Blair House. So she was already using that influence. Who knows what more she could have done in the White House, but I think she carried that interest certainly all her life.
Thank you for answering that one. The last one was related. Someone had a question about fundraising, and I wonder if you could speak. You've spoken a little bit about the White House Guide and the reception efforts related to that, maybe how people reacted to that in Washington, the idea of it, but how has that funded and helped to fund the White House? And how does the White House continue to fund these decorative efforts?
Well, as usual, Mrs. Kennedy was right. That guidebook was wildly popular, as was touring the White House. That was back in a time when the White House was open every day, 5 days a week for tours. But during the Kennedy administration, visitation doubled and then was on its way to tripling in 1963. I've studied the numbers. And if you look at the photographs of people visiting the White House, nearly every one of them is leaving carrying a bag, carrying that guidebook. So the immediate response was positive. And of course, the response to her television tour was very positive. People wanted to be a part of the White House, and that enthusiasm just continued. And with the establishment of the White House Historical Association, of course, they've gone on to create far more than just the guidebook. They have a whole catalog of publications and educational programs. The Curator's Office has grown. The White House Historical Association has grown as a fundraising entity. So they are largely responsible for much of the funding of the things that happen inside the White House that go beyond the traditional appropriations. So what she set in motion has really grown to be such a significant arm of fundraising for the White House, beautifully going to be shown today in the commissioning of the White House portraits, which is a White House Historical Association initiative. So what a great legacy.
Well, Elaine, thank you so much for joining us today. And again, the book is amazing. If you have a chance to get your hands on a copy of it, I highly recommend it. It's gorgeous. I really enjoyed perusing it. The colors and pictures is just really a sumptuous experience. And if you're able to make it to the Winterthur, the exhibition is on view through January, and it sounds like there's some amazing Christmas activity going on there, Christmas trees and decorations inspired by the First Lady. So I'm working on getting our holiday party there.
Good. Please come to Delaware. Thank you so much, Allison. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we will see you at our next program. Have a great day.
Thank you.